If you recall, we're studying Jesus. We're just looking at Jesus. We're also trying to tell him what we see. And in the process of looking at Jesus, specifically through the eyes of John, we want to fall passionately in love with Jesus all over again. And when we passionately love Jesus, it comes out. And it's seen in our lives. Today we're looking at John 5, 1 through 15. Jesus, the Lord of the Sabbath. Let's read this passage together in respect for God's word. Let's stand as we read. Together. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. Now, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had. Now a certain man was there who had infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he already had been in that condition a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I am coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your bed, and walk." And immediately the man who was made well took up his bed and walked. And that day was the Sabbath. The Jews therefore said to him who was cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to cure in your bed." He answered them, "He who made me well said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" Then they asked him, "Who is this man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" But the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, a multitude being in that place. Afterward Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest the worst thing come upon you." The man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who made him well. For this reason the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father has been working until now, and I have been working." Therefore the Jews sought all the more to kill him, because he not only broke the Sabbath, but also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. The Lord add his blessing to the reading of his word. You may be seated. Some of you older people may remember a man by the name of Joe Garagiola. Anybody remember Joe Garagiola? Oh, yeah. 30 years broadcasting baseball for NBC. You know, it's interesting. He played baseball for 8 seasons. He didn't have a spectacular career. He was a catcher. He was traded 4 times when there were only 8 teams in his league. He said at one point that he thought all he was doing was modeling uniforms for the National League. He tells the story that he was catching and they were playing St. Louis, and a rookie pitcher was on the mound. It was the top of the 9th inning. The score was tied 6-6, a man on second and third. And who should come to the plate but Stan the Man Musial? Anybody remember Stan the Man? Oh, yeah. One of the greatest sluggers of all time. And so Garagiola got behind the plate of this rookie, and he saw fear on the face of the rookie. And so he called for a fastball and shook him off. Called for a curve, and the pitcher shook him off. He called for a slider, and the pitcher shook him off. Well, Joe Garagiola said he only had 3 pitches. So I was a bit confused. So I called timeout and went out to the mound. And I said, son, I've called every one of your pitches, and you said no. What's going on? And the guy said, frankly, Joe, I was just wanting to hold on to the ball a little bit longer. That's the attitude that you and I have. Did you know that? That's the life that we live and that we have. We want to keep hanging on to what we know. We don't want to give up on what we know. St. Augustine said, the life to which we're accustomed holds us more than the life we long for. Augustine is saying that in the life we have, as bad as it may be, at least we know what to expect. It's the reason why women who are abused by husbands stay in the marriage. It's why when we're abused and things are bad, we stay rather than walking away. Because we want to hold on just a little bit longer. We have to understand that we can't make excuses. We need to get on with life. You know, today as we look at this passage, we're looking at a story where a man, when Jesus gave him the opportunity to believe, to be healed, made excuses. You know, Jesus said, you want to be healed? He didn't answer the question. He says, nobody will. He made excuses. I can't be healed because nobody. That's not what Jesus asked. What did he ask? Do you want to be healed? Now, I got a question for you today. Do you want to be healed? And our excuse is, the worship isn't quite up to my speed. You know, the people in that church that I attend, that pastor, he's weird, you know. We've got all these excuses. We can blame other people. When Jesus says, do you want to be healed? And the response is, if you want to be healed, take up your bed and walk. We have responsibility in this. Jesus is able to heal us from whatever our situation is. He can he can bring joy and understanding, but he expects something from us. What does he expect? Action. Take up your bed and walk. Don't sit there and make excuses. Don't sit there. Let's look at this passage. We look at the first 5 verses where we have the circumstances of what's going on. The first thing it says is there was a feast of Israel. It doesn't specify which one it is, but we know that there are 3 feasts in Judaism that every Jewish man was supposed to go up to every year. That was Passover. That was 50 days later, the Feast of Weeks, or what we call Pentecost. And finally, the Feast of Tabernacles. It was one of these feasts. We don't know which one. Probably John is telling us to explain why Jesus was in Jerusalem at this time. That's probably why he told him. Not only was it the holiday, the feast, it was also the Sabbath, which is very special. And you look at what John is doing here. John focuses on this like the opening scenes of a movie. They show this huge city from a distance. And then they focus on a building. And then they focus on a crowd. And then they focus on one person. That's what John does here. He starts big and he focuses down to this man who was ill. It all occurred at the pool of Bethesda. The pool of Bethesda was on the northeast corner by the sheep gate. The name of this pool was called Bethesda, or Bethsaida, or it was called Bethsatha, or Belzethda. different writers call it different things. They're all talking about the same place, which we know as Bethesda. And it's interesting, that name. It was found in the 1900s, in the 19th century, underneath a Byzantine church. So they actually found the pool. But it has a reputation of a healing purpose. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he established the National Institute of Health. And he was with his advisor, Harry Hopkins. And they were driving around thinking and talking about where should they put the National Institute of Health as they were driving through Bethesda, Maryland. And Hopkins says, you know the story in the Bible about Bethesda? And Roosevelt went, what a symbolic thing this would be. So they established the National Institute of Health in Bethesda. Symbolic of what was going on there. The pool of Bethesda itself was in the shape of a trapezoid. How many know what a trapezoid is? You know, it's like this, but the sides are like this, so it goes boom, boom, boom. And it consisted of two pools, a northern pool and a southern pool. The northern pool was actually a reservoir for the southern pool. The southern pool had steps in it and was where people would enter for ritual cleansing and that sort of thing. The pool itself, by the dimensions they've uncovered, was 165 by 200 feet. And it was 315 feet deep, long, in that sense. A big place. And around it were 5 covered colonnades, or in other versions, porticos or porches. What was this? We would call it a pile of rocks with an umbrella on top of it. In other words, it provided a roof, a shade. The word that is used here means a colonnade with shade, with a roof. Now, why did they have the roof? It provided a place in the midst of the hot summers to sit in the shade around the pool. It's interesting. Around this pool, there were a multitude of sick. Why were there a multitude of sick gathered around it? Well, verse 4 explains it. There's one problem with verse 4. It probably wasn't in the original manuscript. It is not part of it. I think that verse 4 is what we would call a scribal insertion. In other words, it's not part of the inspired text, but as they were copying it over the years, people will know, why were the sick gathered around the pool? And so someone put this in. It's just a matter of evaluating the oldest manuscripts. And the oldest manuscripts do not have verse 4. And so this is probably a tradition of why the people were there. And the tradition was that an angel came at different times, stirred the water, and the first one to jump in the pool, do a header, got to be healed. Now, is this actually what occurred? Or was this an explanation of the tradition? The point is, this is not necessarily what God was doing, it's what the people thought. And somebody put that in to explain why there were so many people around that. I personally don't think it was part of the original. We do know a lot of people were around there for probably their perceived reason that if they got in there quick enough, they'd be healed. And here was this man. You look at this man, his condition. The man's condition was he was paralyzed in some way. Why? Don't know. Some people suggest maybe he had rheumatoid arthritis. I don't know. He had some sort of illness. We know he had this illness for 38 years. That's a good long time. How old was he? I don't know. But if he was 12 years old when he contracted, that would make him 50, And if he was a young adult, say 22, he was at least 60. So this was not a spry kid in all of this. So Jesus picks this guy out. You know what puzzles me? Why him? I mean, there could have been a little child, and I'm sure there were children around. Why didn't he pick one of them? How about ladies? Were there ladies around there probably? Why didn't he pick one of them? And the definitive answer is, I don't know. God's sovereign, God has a purpose, but there's some reason. Maybe it was because this man had been around so long that everybody knew that he wasn't faking. Okay? Maybe. I mean, I'm speculating at this point. And that if he healed him, people would have to see that something spectacular happened. It was God who was doing it, and this was no trick, because they've seen him for 38 years. I don't know. But you know what Jesus does? He cures this man. He heals him. And the man himself, you look at him, Jesus said, do you want to be made well? And what does he do? Give excuses. He doesn't answer. All he does is complain. None of us can relate to this. None of us. Because none of us have ever been in circumstances where we just sit there and don't do anything and we blame other people. It's not my fault. It's whoever. But you look at Jesus. It's interesting what we can see about Jesus in this passage. First, look at the fact of what he knew. He knew this man. How did he know? I know the answer to this one. He's God. And God knows everything. He knows our thoughts. He knows what people are thinking. And so he knew him because as God he did. You know, I love Psalm 139. He knows my thoughts from afar away. Before the words are formed on my tongue, he knows what I will say. That's God. And Jesus knew this man. He had great compassion for him. I was reading in my devotions this morning this very thing. God is compassionate to the evil and unrighteous. I just stopped and had to think about that today. He is compassionate. And you know what the very next thing it says? So should we be. So should we be. Compassionate to the evil and the unrighteous. If he's compassionate to me, we should be compassionate to others. There's no place for the self-righteous in the church. Because none of us have any righteousness to brag of. All our righteousnesses are as filthy rags. So there's nothing to be proud of other than the fact we've been saved by a merciful and compassionate God. And look at his power. Jesus can command like that and it happens. He says, peace, be still, and the winds obey instantly. He can turn to a disease and says, be gone, and it's gone. He say, be healed, and bones that don't function, function. He can say, walk, and someone, if you know and you've been through any surgeries or anything where you have to learn to walk again, as in when you have two knees done at the same time. You don't just get up and start running. No, Wayne won't let me run anyway. You have to learn it all over. There's miracle upon miracle because not only are the bones and muscles healed, but instantly they can walk. This is beyond explanation from a human standpoint. God has the power to do that. God has but to speak and were healed. What were the consequences? Well, in verses 10 through 15, we see a number of things. The first thing that we see are the Sabbath police. Now, none of y'all know what the Sabbath police are, do you? We have them throughout the church. Only we don't call them the Sabbath police. We call them the rule keepers. The ones that make sure everybody follows the rules. I mean, you have to measure up, and if you don't do it this way, you're a sinner. You know that. And we call it legalism today, don't we? But it's still prevalent. In Jesus' day, the Pharisees, the Sadducees were meticulous in keeping the law. They went through the Old Testament law and discovered there were 613 commands. And they said, that's not enough. We've got to protect things. For instance, keep the Sabbath holy. That's a command. Well, they say, wait. We have to specify what that means. So they came up with 39 different things that you have to or cannot do on the Sabbath, or otherwise you're breaking the Sabbath. For instance, if you walk more than a quarter of a mile on the Sabbath, you're working. But if you place an article that belongs to you a quarter of a mile away and you walk to that, you haven't walked a quarter of a mile yet. You can walk another quarter of a mile. And if you have an article that belongs to you in a quarter of a mile beyond that, guess what you can do? You can go another quarter of a mile. Well, they built this hedge to protect the Sabbath. You know what the 39th rule was? You shall not carry your bed on the Sabbath. I'm serious. This was the 39th thing. And what did Jesus tell this guy to do on the Sabbath? Take up your bed and walk. Do you think Jesus was thumbing his nose just a little bit at the rule makers? I think he did it purposefully. Why? Because they were not establishing rules to keep the Sabbath holy. They were establishing the rules to violate the Sabbath, so that they could actually violate it and do what was wrong. For instance, one of the rules they had is, you can, if you swear on the door of the temple, you don't have to keep it. But if you swear on the doorknob of the temple, you have to keep that vow. So they allow you to make vows and not keep it. You can lie. The Sabbath police were more concerned about their rules than God's rules. And so Jesus didn't measure up to their standards. Just as many people in church today judge and condemn others by their standards as opposed to God's standards. You look at this man that was healed. I don't think this man had faith. He didn't know who Jesus was. Therefore, how could he believe in Jesus? They asked him, who healed you? And he went, oh. It says he didn't know. Sometimes we have the mistaken opinion that if we just have enough faith, God will be accountable to do anything we ask because we got faith. How much faith did this guy have? I don't think he had any. Jesus raised the dead. How much faith did the dead person have? Let me give you a hint. Duh. They're dead. How much faith did they have? It's not an issue of how much faith you have. It's an issue of God. The thing that's fascinating about this is when he went back to Jesus and found where Jesus is, Jesus turned to him and says, don't sin anymore. You know what that seems to indicate to me? This guy's sickness was because he had sinned. Careful here. Not all illness is a result of sin. It is in the sense of Adam's sin. But just because you're sick or have an accident or injury, I know when I was young, every time something bad happened to me, I was sure it was because I'd done something wrong. Well, I probably had. But is that the reason why you get sick or illnesses? And the answer is, no, be careful. Remember, Paul had a thorn in his flesh. Was it because he was a sinner? No, it was because God wanted to keep him humble. You look at various episodes in Scripture. Not everything that happens is caused by sin. You understand that? You can't say that, I was in the hospital because I badmouthed my husband or, something like that, or whatever it is. Now, God can use illness to point out sin in our life. You understand that? He can. But don't blame everything that happens to you. Immediately say, oh, they're sick because they lived an inappropriate lifestyle. Be careful of that. You know what you're doing? If you do that, you're becoming Sabbath police. Be very careful about that. You remember in John chapter 9, a little bit later we'll talk about this, there's a blind man, and the disciples said, who sinned, him or his parents, that he should be blind? And what did Jesus say? Neither, so that God may be glorified. So be careful. But he did tell him, go and sin no more. You know what this tells me? I mean, here's the marvelous principle that I get out of this passage. I mean, it's the central focus point. God wants to heal people spiritually. And he healed physically only to get his attention so he could do the spiritual. We have many things going on in the world today where the church is trying to help the physical needs of people. I think that's wonderful. But that's only the start. The end goal always has to be helping them spiritually, to know Jesus and to turn their lives back to him. And if they leave out that aspect of it, they miss the entire point. Jesus healed this man so that he could heal him spiritually. And we help people in need. Why? So that we can help them spiritually. That has to be our thrust. Now, what happened to Jesus as a result of this? The divine healer. He did something good, and what did they do? They hated him. They persecuted him. They wanted to kill him. Why? He broke their rules. Let me repeat that. He broke their rules, not God's rules. Did Jesus ever violate God's rules? Do you do good on the Sabbath? Everybody knows it. Nobody stops working on the Sabbath. You get up and you eat. You have to go to the bathroom. There's all sorts of work you do. Nobody ceases working. So do you do good stuff on the Sabbath? And he did good stuff. He healed people. And when you do that, when you violate other people's rules and regulations, you're going to tick them off. Because I am the judge. And you just better not cross this judge. Really? There's one judge, and his name is Jesus. And so, understand this, if you do good things, you know what probably is going to happen? People will hate you. Especially when you point out their spiritual needs. They did it to Jesus. They'll probably do it to us. You look at this story and we ask ourselves, how's my life going to be different? How do I become a better disciple of Jesus? How do I fall in love with Jesus all over again? Let me give you 3 applications I came up with. 3 things that God spoke to me about. The first thing I came up with is those who judge and condemn others often miss out on seeing God's love and mercy upon themselves. They're so busy condemning and judging others. This is what happened in Corinth. You've read the book of Corinthians? They were judging one another, and I'm of Paul, and I'm of Apollos, and I speak in tongues, and you don't. I mean, everybody's evaluating everybody, and Paul says, don't do that. Don't measure and compare yourselves with others. And yet, so often we're doing. People can be so busy doing the negative that they never see the good and positive that God is doing. It's so much fun cutting down others and seeing they're wrong that we have no time to see what good God has done for me. As I was saying for my devotions this morning, God is compassionate to me. Therefore, I need to be compassionate and merciful to the same ones Jesus is. And who is he merciful to? The evil and unrighteous. Wow. Don't get so busy condemning others, judging others, being negative, that we lose sight of the grace and mercy of God in our own life, so that we can be gracious and merciful to others. Second thing, stop making excuses and do something. I'm too old. I'm too young. I haven't been to school. I haven't been trained. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough time. You know what that is? An excuse. An excuse is just a reason you give not to do what God's told you to do. Quit making excuses and do something. Do something with your life. I've been around so many people in my life who are nothing but complainers. How you doing? Oh, I'm miserable. I mean, it's not just one. I mean, if you're miserable, you should tell people you're miserable, okay? That's being honest. But that's all their life is miserableness and complaining and griping. And I'm such a victim. I mean, my dad mistreated me when I was little. My neighbor's dog barks all the time, keeps me awake, and makes me irritable all the time. That's just a story. It's not real. Actually, it is. We're always a victim. Always somebody else's fault. So much of our society is, it's my parents' fault I turned out the way I am. No, it's yours. You chose. I'm miserable. Why are you miserable? You made yourself miserable. I mean, people don't like to hear that. It's human nature. Adam, when God caught him, what did he say? It's that woman. Yep, it's that woman that you gave me. It was her fault. Moses talks to Aaron. Where'd this golden calf come from? Well, it's these people. I just threw the gold in and out popped this golden calf. Oh, come off of it. It's the fire's fault. The fire made this golden calf. You know what some of the most humble words you can ever say are? It's my fault. I accept responsibility, and I'm going to do something about it. And that's what God expects of us. He's healed us. He's given the joy of life. And if there's no joy, it's because we've chosen otherwise. Choose joy. I've heard that somewhere before. Take up your bed and walk. Don't make excuses. Just do it. One last thing. One's eternal destiny is more important than one's temporal disability. Too much of our society today is focused on the temporal as opposed to the eternal. We see hardship
and other things. And we complain. And yet God has purpose. And God's more concerned about our souls than our bank account. There are people that have gone through terrific tragedies in life and yet have such great joy. You look at Johnny Erickson Tata. I mean, as a teenager being paralyzed, a quadriplegic for life. And look what she's done with her life. You could look at it and say, oh, these temporal disabilities have made me nothing. In our own midst, you look at Karen Stubbs. Many of y'all remember Karen. My goodness. When I was 16 years old, there was an evangelist that came through the area. He drove his own van. You know, I lived out in the country, so we had good old country revivals. And here comes this evangelist. I went to see him. He was born without arms or legs. Drove his own van all around the country, telling people about the marvelous grace of a loving Lord who made him this way so that people would listen when he told them about Jesus. I mean, this guy, he had temporal disabilities, but he didn't let them stop him from doing what God would have him to do. So often we focus on the temporal, food, shelter, clothing, and I'm not saying those things are not important. Y'all understand that? But that becomes our focus. What should be our focus? The heart and soul before God. That is what's important. Everything else is just temporary. Where's your heart today? Are you making excuses, or are you willing to pick up your bed and walk? Choice is yours. Take up your bed. Walk. Would you join me in prayer?